I'll never be a ball player. You'd be a AAA ball player. That's about it. And I said, nope, I won't sign for that. But it's funny, when I signed with the Yankees, I get a telegram from Branch Rickey. He knew he was going to the Dodgers. He told me he didn't want me to sign with the Cardinals. That's what you wanted here, I know. And he sent a telegram, reported Berra Mountain for spring training with the Dodgers. And it was too late, though. I already signed with the Yankees.
The tragic truth about Yogi Berra is that just 2 months before he died at 90, baseball left one of its greatest winners off its franchise 4 list. It was July 2015. Major League Baseball asked fans to vote for the 4 greatest living players in the sport's history. When the results came out, 4 names were read aloud. Hank Aaron, Johnny Bench, Sandy Koufax, Willie Mays. Yogi Berra's name was not one of them. That should not have been possible. Berra had more championship rings than all 4 of those players combined. He had won 3 MVP awards. He had been an All-Star 18 times. Yet somehow, in the eyes of many fans, he had become something smaller than a legend. He had become a punchline, and as the real man behind those jokes starts to come into view, use the hype feature and give this video some hype, so more people can discover who Yogi Berra truly was. This is not the story of a foolish man who happened to become famous by accident. It is the story of a smart, brave, and deeply principled man who spent most of his life being underestimated. People laughed at his round face, his short legs, and his strange way of talking. They repeated his sayings at parties and on television, treating him like a walking joke book. Very few of them stopped to ask how a man that dumb could win 10 World Series rings, more than any player in the history of the game. The answer is that he was not dumb at all. He was one of the smartest players to ever put on a catcher's mitt. He read pitchers like a book. He remembered every hitter's weakness. He called games with a mind that never stopped working, even while his mouth was busy making people laugh. The gap between how people saw him and who he actually was is the real tragedy of Yogi Berra's life. That gap did not start with baseball, and it did not end with baseball either. It began back when he was a poor boy in St. Louis, working jobs instead of going to school, being told again and again that he was too short, too round, and too plain to ever make it. Long before he wore a Yankees uniform, he had already learned how to keep working while the world doubted him. To understand how he became the most misunderstood winner in baseball history, we have to go back to where it all started. In a crowded Italian neighborhood during the hardest years of the Great Depression. In a house where every extra dollar mattered more than any game ever could. Lawrence Peter Berra was born on May 12, 1925 in St. Louis, Missouri. His family lived in a neighborhood called The Hill, a tightly packed area filled with Italian immigrants who had come to America looking for a better life. His parents, Pietro and Paolina, had crossed the ocean from northern Italy with almost nothing. They built their whole world around hard work and family loyalty, and they expected their children to do the same. Berra grew up during the Great Depression, a time when jobs were scarce and money was tight for almost every family in the country. His father worked long, exhausting hours at the Laclede Christie Clay Company brickyard, hauling and shaping clay for very little pay. To Pietro Berra, sports were a nice distraction for boys with free time. They were not a real job, and they were not going to put food on the table. In his eyes, baseball was something you played after the work was done, not something you built a future around. That belief shaped young Lawrence's life directly. He left school after the 8th grade so he could help support his family. From that point on, he worked wherever he could find pay. He shoveled coal. He worked in a shoe factory. He drove delivery routes for a living. These were not easy jobs for a teenage boy, but they were what his family needed, and he did them without complaint. Whatever time was left after work, Berra spent playing baseball. He played on sandlots with makeshift equipment and dusty fields. He played in the American Legion League with local boys from his neighborhood. Even without formal coaching or fancy training, something about the way he saw the game set him apart. He had a natural feel for hitting, for timing, and for reading what a pitcher was about to throw. Unfortunately, the people who were supposed to notice that talent were too busy noticing something else. Berra was short and stocky, standing only about 5 feet 7 inches tall. He did not look like the tall, lean athletes that scouts were trained to expect. Instead of watching how he played, many of them simply looked at his body and made up their minds before he ever swung a bat. The clearest example of this came when the St. Louis Cardinals held a tryout. Branch Rickey, the team's general manager, was one of the most respected talent evaluators in all of baseball. He watched Berra and his childhood friend, Joe Garagiola, try out on the same day. Rickey chose to sign Garagiola. He passed on Berra completely, deciding that his frame and appearance simply did not fit what a future star was supposed to look like. It would have been easy for a young man to feel crushed by that kind of rejection, especially from someone as powerful as Branch Rickey. Being told by one of the most respected men in baseball that you simply do not have what it takes could break a person's confidence for good. But Berra did not let it break him. He did not sulk, and he did not demand anyone feel sorry for him. He simply kept working, kept playing whenever he had the chance, and kept believing there might be another opportunity somewhere down the road. This quiet, steady response says a great deal about who Berra really was. Long before anyone outside his neighborhood knew his name, he was not chasing attention. He was not looking for anyone to hand him anything. He had learned, from watching his own father grind through hours at the brickyard, that the only real answer to hard times was to keep working and let effort speak for you. That opportunity would eventually come, but before it could, history had other plans for him. The whole world was at war, and soon a teenage boy from a poor Italian neighborhood in St. Louis would find himself heading into one of the most dangerous military operations in modern history. Baseball would have to wait. In 1943, at just 18 years old, Lawrence Berra enlisted in the United States Navy. World War II was raging across Europe and the Pacific, and like millions of other young American men, he put his own future on hold to serve his country. His dream of playing professional baseball would have to wait. Right now, there was a war to fight. The Navy trained him as a gunner's mate, teaching him how to operate weapons under pressure and stay calm in dangerous situations. He was assigned to a large ship called the USS Bayfield, which carried troops and equipment across the ocean toward the fighting in Europe. From there, he was placed on a much smaller vessel, a 6-man rocket boat known as a Landing Craft Support Small. Then came June 6, 1944. This was D-Day, the massive Allied invasion of Normandy, France. It would become one of the most important military operations in modern history, a turning point in the fight against Nazi Germany. Berra's small rocket boat was sent in close to 2 of the most dangerous beaches in the entire invasion, Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. His job, and the job of the 5 other sailors on his boat, was to provide covering fire for the soldiers storming the beaches. They launched rockets and fired machine guns at German positions dug into the cliffs and dunes above the shore. They were doing this from roughly 300 yards offshore, close enough to see the fighting with their own eyes and close enough to be hit by German gunners firing back. Sailors who served on these small support boats gave their mission a grim nickname. They called it the Landing Craft Suicide Squad. That name was not an exaggeration. Many boats like Berra's took heavy fire. Many young men serving on them did not survive the day. Berra was there in the middle of it, watching friends and fellow sailors face injury and death only yards away from him. During the chaos of the invasion, Berra and his crew were fired upon repeatedly. At one point, they helped rescue an American pilot who had been shot down after friendly anti-aircraft fire went wrong, a tragic accident that happened more than once during the confusion of battle. Berra pulled the pilot from the water and helped bring him to safety, one small act of courage among thousands happening across the beaches that day. D-Day was not the end of his time in danger. Later in the war, during a separate military campaign known as Operation Dragoon in the Mediterranean, Berra was wounded in action. For his injury and his service, he received the Purple Heart, one of the most respected military honors given to American service members hurt in combat. What is perhaps most remarkable about this entire chapter of his life is how little Berra spoke about it afterward. He became one of the most quoted men in American history, famous for his playful sayings and his willingness to joke around with reporters. Yet when it came to what he saw and did on the beaches of Normandy, he stayed almost completely silent for the rest of his life. This was not because the experience did not matter to him. It clearly did. The research makes clear that he carried the weight of that day privately, choosing not to make his wartime service the center of his public identity. He never used it to build his image, and he rarely brought it up even when reporters asked. This quiet emotional reserve, this habit of carrying hard things without complaint, would follow him through every difficult moment of the rest of his life. Think about that for a moment. A man who watched friends die on a beach in France, who was shot at, who helped pull a drowning airman from the ocean, who was later wounded in his own right, spent decades afterward being mocked as a simple, funny character who did not understand much of anything. The truth is that some of the bravest and most serious moments of his life were the very moments he talked about the least. When the war finally ended and Berra returned home, baseball was waiting for him again. The boy who had been rejected by the Cardinals and had spent a teenage year fighting off the coast of France was about to get the chance he had always wanted, a real shot in the major leagues. On September 22, 1946, Yogi Berra made his major league debut with the New York Yankees. He was no longer the boy who had been passed over by the Cardinals. He was a Yankee now, and over the next 18 seasons he would become the tactical heart of one of the greatest dynasties in the history of American sports. To understand how good Berra actually was, you have to look past the jokes and look at the numbers. Across his career, he collected 2,150 hits, 358 home runs, and 1,430 runs batted in. Those are not the numbers of a lucky role player who happened to be in the right place. Those are the numbers of one of the most productive catchers to ever play the game. He was selected to 18 All-Star teams across 15 straight seasons. He won the American League Most Valuable Player Award 3 separate times, in 1951, 1953, and 1955. Only a small handful of players in the entire history of the American League have ever won 3 MVP awards. Berra was one of them, and he did it while playing the most physically demanding position on the field, catcher, game after game, year after year. And then there are the championships. 10 times, Berra won the World Series as a player. That is more World Series rings than any other player in baseball history, a record that still stands today. If you count his years connected to the Yankees organization beyond his playing days, the number of championships tied to his name climbs even higher. No single player has ever won more. Winning that often is not an accident. It requires more than talent. It requires understanding, memory, and the ability to make the right decision over and over again under pressure. This is where Berra's true intelligence showed itself, far away from the funny sayings people love to repeat. Behind the plate, Berra had an extraordinary memory for how opposing hitters swung and what pitches gave them trouble. He tracked patterns across entire seasons, remembering small details about a hitter's stance or timing that most players would forget within a single game. Pitchers trusted him because he seemed to always know what was coming before it happened. He called games with the calm confidence of a chess player thinking several moves ahead, even while wearing catcher's gear in the summer heat. His defensive skill was just as impressive. At one stretch of his career, Berra played 148 consecutive games behind the plate without making a single error, an incredible display of focus and consistency at one of the hardest positions in sports. In 1956, he caught one of the most famous games ever played, Don Larsen's perfect game in the World Series, a game in which not a single opposing batter reached base. Being the man crouched behind the plate for that kind of perfection is no small thing. It requires total command of every pitch and every hitter. At the plate, Berra had a hitting style that broke all the normal rules, and somehow it worked better than almost anyone else's. He was famous for swinging at pitches well outside the strike zone, pitches that most hitters would never even attempt to touch. He explained his approach in his own simple way, saying that if he could see the ball, he could hit it. Traditional coaches might have called that reckless. The results proved it was actually brilliant. Consider his 1950 season. In 597 at-bats that year, Berra hit 28 home runs while striking out only 12 times. 28 home runs, only 12 strikeouts, in nearly 600 trips to the plate. Most power hitters who swing hard enough to hit that many home runs strike out far more often, sometimes 100 times or more in a single season. Berra could swing for power and still make contact almost every single time he stepped into the batter's box. That kind of hand-eye coordination and plate discipline is exceptionally rare, even among the greatest hitters who have ever lived. None of this happened because Berra was simply carried along by a great team around him. He was one of the reasons that team was great in the first place. As a hitter, a defender, a game caller, and a quiet leader in the clubhouse, he was central to nearly every championship the Yankees won during his playing days. The dynasty needed his bat, his glove, and above all, his mind. It is worth pausing on just how unusual that combination really is. Plenty of players in baseball history have hit for power. Plenty of players have played strong defense. Very few players have ever done both at an elite level, while also serving as the person calling every single pitch for the entire pitching staff. That is an enormous mental load to carry across a full season, let alone across 18 of them. Berra managed it so smoothly and so consistently that people mistook his calm, easy manner for a lack of seriousness. In reality, that calmness was the product of total mastery over every part of his job. Put all of it together, the 10 championships, the 3 MVP awards, the 18 All-Star selections, the elite hitting numbers, and the flawless defensive stretches, and one thing becomes very clear. The man mocked for being short, round, and simple was actually one of the most skilled and dependable players of his entire era. He belongs in the conversation with the very best players baseball has ever produced. Yet even as Berra was winning championship after championship, proving his greatness on the field year after year, the world outside the ballpark kept treating him like a punchline. His success on the diamond did not stop people from mocking how he looked and how he talked. If anything, his growing fame only gave more people a reason to laugh at him instead of celebrating what he had actually accomplished. While Yogi Berra was busy proving himself to be one of the smartest and most skilled players of his generation, the world outside baseball had already decided he was something else entirely, a funny-looking man who was not very bright. The mockery started with his appearance. Berra was short, stocky, and round-faced, nothing like the tall, sharp-featured stars that magazines like to put on their covers. Opposing players and even some of his own teammates poked fun at how he looked and how he ran the bases. Sports writers wrote about him in ways that focused far more on his body than on his batting average. Some of the language used against him in his early career was uglier than simple teasing. Team leaders, managers, and media figures sometimes used cruel and dehumanizing nicknames, comparing his appearance to an ape or a monkey. These insults were tied to ugly Italian-American stereotypes that were common at the time, stereotypes that painted Italian immigrants and their children as less intelligent and less refined than other Americans. Berra, the son of 2 Italian immigrants, absorbed a share of that prejudice throughout his career. At the same time, his own way of speaking became a target. Berra had a habit of expressing simple truths in strange, twisted little phrases, sentences that sounded backwards or confused at first but actually made a strange kind of sense once you thought about them. Sayings like, "It ain't over till it's over," or "When you come to a fork in the road, take it," became famous across the entire country. These sayings turned Berra into something like a folk hero. People loved repeating them. Companies wanted him in their commercials. Talk show hosts wanted him as a guest. In many ways, this made him one of the most beloved and recognizable men in America, far beyond the world of baseball. That was the blessing of his strange way of talking. But there was a curse hidden inside that blessing. The more famous his sayings became, the more people remembered him for his words instead of his playing. Many younger fans grew up knowing Yogi Berra only as the funny old man who said confusing things on television, with no idea that the same man had once been one of the most feared hitters and smartest defensive catchers in the entire sport. This confusion between his image and his ability was not helped by a cartoon character. In 1958, the animation studio Hanna-Barbera created a bear named Yogi Berra, a cheerful, clumsy character loosely inspired by the real Berra. The cartoon became extremely popular with children across America. It also cemented in the minds of an entire generation the idea that Yogi Berra was a cartoonish figure rather than a serious professional athlete. None of this means that Berra hated his own sayings or that he resented his fame. Nothing in his history suggests that he pushed back against being loved by the public. He seemed to accept his role as a beloved character with the same quiet good humor he brought to everything else in his life. The tragedy is not that he became famous for the wrong reasons. The tragedy is that his true greatness, the discipline, the memory, the game intelligence, got buried underneath that fame instead of being celebrated alongside it. Underneath the smiling, joke-telling public image, there was a mind that never stopped working. Berra understood pitching sequences the way a skilled mechanic understands an engine. He read hitters the way a teacher reads a classroom, instantly picking up on nerves, weaknesses, and habits. None of that intelligence disappeared just because people preferred to laugh at his sayings instead of studying his instincts. It is worth remembering that speaking in an unusual way is not the same thing as being unintelligent. Plenty of clever people express themselves in ways that sound odd out of context. Berra simply had the misfortune of saying his strange little truths in front of microphones and reporters who found it much easier to print a funny quote than to explain the finer points of catching, pitch calling, or plate discipline. A joke fits neatly into a headline. A breakdown of defensive strategy does not. That difference alone helps explain why the world remembered his words far longer than it remembered his skill. There would come a moment, though, when that hidden intelligence and that fierce competitive spirit broke through the friendly public image for everyone to see. It happened on one of the biggest stages in the sport, during a World Series, in a moment that revealed just how deeply Berra cared about winning and how far he was willing to go to defend it. The moment came during Game 1 of the 1955 World Series, a matchup between the New York Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers. In the 8th inning, Dodgers star Jackie Robinson made a bold decision. He broke for home plate, attempting one of the most daring plays in baseball, a steal of home in the middle of a World Series game. Yankees pitcher Whitey Ford delivered the pitch. Berra crouched behind the plate, caught the ball and spun to apply the tag on the charging Robinson. For a split second, the entire play came down to timing, the ball reaching Berra's glove and the glove reaching Robinson's body before his foot touched home plate. Home plate umpire Bill Summers made the call. Safe. Robinson was ruled safe at home, and the Dodgers had their run. Berra did not accept that ruling quietly. He shot up from his crouch and argued furiously with Summers, jumping and gesturing in protest, absolutely certain that his tag had beaten Robinson to the plate. A photographer captured the moment, and that image, Berra red-faced and arguing at home plate, became one of the most famous photographs in baseball history. What makes this moment so revealing is not who was actually right. The research is clear that this remains a genuinely disputed call to this day. Berra always insisted, for the rest of his life, that Robinson was out, that his tag had arrived in time. Robinson and his supporters always maintained the opposite. Decades later, fans and historians still debate the exact timing of that play, and no recording exists that settles the argument beyond doubt. What the moment does reveal is something about Berra's character that his public image often hid. This was not the relaxed, joke-telling Yogi that appeared in commercials and interviews. This was a furious competitor, someone who cared enormously about winning, and who remembered every tiny detail of a play that most players would have simply accepted and moved past. That intensity, hidden underneath his easygoing public persona, was very real. Berra was not just a beloved character who happened to wander through a World Series. He was a man who tracked every pitch, argued every close call, and held on to his convictions about that moment for the rest of his life. The disputed play with Robinson stands as a small window into how seriously Berra took the game he loved. Long after the cameras had stopped rolling and the jokes had stopped landing, this was a genuine World Series moment between two legendary teams. Not a personal feud between two men. The disagreement was about a single close play, nothing more, and both men moved on with their careers. That same intensity and that same sense of personal principle would resurface many years later, but in a much more painful setting. Instead of arguing a single close call on the field, Berra would find himself fighting for his dignity against the very organization he had given his career to. By the mid-1980s, Berra had returned to the New York Yankees for a second stint as manager. Before the 1985 season began, team owner George Steinbrenner made him a direct promise. Whatever happened early in the year, Berra would be allowed to manage the full season. There would be no snap decisions and no early panic. Berra had earned that much trust after decades of loyal service to the organization. That promise did not last long. The Yankees stumbled out of the gate, winning only 6 of their first 16 games. It was a rough start, but it was still very early in a long season, the exact kind of slow stretch that a promise like Steinbrenner's was supposed to protect against. Instead, Steinbrenner broke his word almost immediately. Berra was fired after just 16 games. Worse than the firing itself was the way it happened. Steinbrenner did not deliver the news to Berra in person. Instead, he sent general manager Clyde King to walk into the manager's office and tell Berra he was done. The owner who had made the promise was not even willing to look Berra in the eye while breaking it. For a man who had given so much of his life to the Yankees organization, playing 18 seasons, coaching, managing, representing the team publicly for decades, this was more than just a professional setback. It was a personal insult. Berra had trusted Steinbrenner's word. Having that trust discarded so casually, and having the bad news delivered second-hand rather than face-to-face, cut deeply. Berra responded in a way that said everything about his character. He did not create a public scandal. He did not go on television to attack Steinbrenner or demand an apology. Instead, he made a quiet, personal vow. As long as George Steinbrenner owned the New York Yankees, Yogi Berra would never set foot inside Yankee Stadium again, and he kept that vow. For 14 full years, Berra stayed away from the stadium where he had won 10 championships. He skipped Old Timers Day celebrations. He turned down organizational invitations. He missed out on being publicly celebrated at the very ballpark where his career had been built. all because of a principle he refused to compromise on. 14 years is an enormous amount of time to hold a boundary. Think about everything that happens in 14 years. Entire careers rising and falling, children growing into adults, whole eras of a sport coming and going. Through all of it, Berra held his ground quietly, without drama, simply refusing to return until something changed. Something finally did change on January 5, 1999. George Steinbrenner traveled to the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center in Montclair, New Jersey, to see Berra in person. He came to apologize, and he did so directly and sincerely, admitting that firing Berra the way he did had been a serious mistake, and acknowledging Berra's reputation as a deeply principled man. Berra accepted the apology. He did not hold on to the grudge simply for the sake of holding on to it. Once Steinbrenner had shown real accountability, Berra let the years of hurt go. Shortly afterward, he returned to Yankee Stadium for opening day in 1999, walking back into the ballpark he had avoided for 14 years. This entire chapter reveals something important about who Berra really was underneath the public caricature. His 14-year absence was never about stubbornness for its own sake. It was about self-respect. He set a clear boundary after being genuinely wronged, and he held that boundary with quiet dignity for over a decade. When a sincere apology finally came, he was willing to forgive completely. That combination, firm principle paired with a real capacity to forgive, says more about Berra's character than almost anything else in his long life. While this very public standoff with Steinbrenner played out across more than a decade, an entirely different and far more private struggle was unfolding inside Berra's own family, one that had nothing to do with baseball at all. Dale Berra was Yogi's youngest son, and like his father, he found his way into Major League Baseball, playing as an infielder for several years. For a while, it must have felt like a proud continuation of the family legacy, a Berra once again taking the field at the highest level of the sport. But during the mid-1980s, Dale's life took a difficult turn. He became caught up in cocaine addiction, a struggle that pulled him into one of the most serious scandals in baseball at the time, the 1985 Pittsburgh drug trials. His name became publicly connected to drug use in a way that brought shame and heartbreak into the Berra household. For Yogi and his wife Carmen, watching their son struggle with addiction in such a public way caused deep emotional pain. This was not a private family matter that stayed behind closed doors. Yogi and Carmen Berra had met in St. Louis, back when Yogi was still a young man trying to make his way into professional baseball. They married in 1949, and their partnership lasted an extraordinary 65 years. Carmen was far more than just his wife. She was his protector, his closest companion, and the steady presence behind so many of the decisions and difficulties of his long public life. In March 2014, that 65-year partnership came to an end. Carmen died following complications from a stroke. For a man who had faced war, public mockery, professional betrayal, and a son's addiction with quiet strength, this loss struck at the very center of his life. Family members noticed the change in him almost immediately. Yogi became quieter. He became more withdrawn. He seemed physically frail in a way he had not seen before. Then, just 7 months later, in October 2014, another blow arrived. This time in the form of a crime. A group of thieves broke into the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center. They stole 9 of Berra's 10 original World Series championship rings, along with 2 of his American League MVP plaques. Physical symbols of an entire lifetime of achievement. The thieves were not interested in preserving history. Investigators later discovered that the stolen items had been melted down for their raw gold, with the gemstones sold off separately in Manhattan's Diamond District for around $12,000. The financial value of what was destroyed came to more than $1 million, but the real loss went far beyond money. These were irreplaceable pieces of American sports history, symbols of championships that could never be won again in exactly the same way, reduced to melted metal for a quick payday. Then, in July 2015, only 2 months before his death, came one final public snub. Major League Baseball's fan voted Franchise 4 promotion named the 4 greatest living players in the sport's history. Berra, despite holding more championship rings than all 4 selected players combined, along with his 3 MVP awards and his defensive brilliance, was left off the list entirely. Yogi Berra died on September 22, 2015, from natural causes, at the age of 90. In a detail that feels almost impossible to invent, his death came exactly 69 years to the day after his very first Major League Baseball game. Taken together, these final years form one of the most painful stretches in his long life, the loss of his life partner of 65 years, the theft and destruction of physical proof of his greatest achievements, a public snub that once again buried his real legacy underneath decades of misunderstanding. Any one of these events alone would have been difficult to bear. Facing all of them within roughly 18 months of each other, at the very end of his life, is a genuinely heartbreaking sequence. And yet, even surrounded by that much loss, the story of Yogi Berra does not end in bitterness. What came next, in the final accounting of his life, is a picture of a man who absorbed every one of these blows without losing who he was, and who left behind a legacy that outlasted every insult, every theft, and every snub aimed his way. So was Yogi Berra's life sad? In many ways, yes. He grew up poor, working manual jobs instead of finishing school. He faced real danger during a war he rarely spoke about. He was mocked for his looks and dismissed as unintelligent for most of his career, even while he was quietly one of the smartest players the game has ever seen. He was betrayed by an organization he had given his whole life to. He helped guide a son through addiction. He lost his wife of 65 years. He watched thieves melt down his championship rings for scrap gold. And in the final months of his life, baseball itself seemed to forget how great he truly was. But none of that sadness ever defined him. When his son needed help, Berra stepped in and stayed until Dale was safe. When George Steinbrenner finally offered a sincere apology, Berra accepted it fully, choosing forgiveness over 14 years of justified resentment. When strangers only ever saw a cartoonish, funny old man, Berra remained warm and gracious anyway, never using his fame as a weapon, and never turning bitter toward the fans who loved him. For as long as his health allowed, he continued showing up for his museum and for the community that had grown around his name. Berra protected his dignity throughout every single one of these hardships, and he never let go of his warmth in the process. His real legacy was never just a collection of funny sayings repeated at parties. It was 10 championship rings earned through genuine skill, a war survived with quiet courage, a family protected through crisis, and a boundary held and eventually forgiven with grace. Yogi Berra's life proves something powerful. Real greatness can exist inside a person the world keeps underestimating. The world spent decades laughing at the man on the surface, never noticing the depth underneath. In the end, that depth, his loyalty, his forgiveness, his quiet strength through loss after loss, is the real story truly worth remembering, far more than any joke could ever be. That is the truth about how Yogi Berra really lived.